Welcome to my channel. I'm Dr. Dastardly, and over the years I've experienced some pretty crazy shit that for most people would absolutely make their heads spin. Now, if you love scary, creepy and just different stories, then you've found the right channel. So please subscribe to my channel, hit the notification button, bell thing, and you won't miss a thing. Now, for me, I'm a storyteller, but not by choice. See, it really just happened to me over years of haunting and misfortune I experienced as a kid. It all mostly came about because of the house that I grew up in, and it was riddled with this sort of stuff. I grew up in a small fibro cement sheet house in the back streets of Melbourne with my older sister and my parents. My father was a blue-collar factory worker who worked the graveyard shift, and my mother was a full-blown schizophrenic who battled alcoholism pretty much her whole life. Sad but true. For the most part, we were left to make do with what we had and get by as best as we could, like most other working class families. But it was the house and what happened within it that for us became the hardest part to cope with growing up. You see, the house, although small and quite lost on this massive large block that it sat on, was so big, the block itself was so big that you could probably fit 8 or 9 modern day houses on it. The yard was sparse with trees and garden, and in the early days there wasn't even an inside toilet within the house. If you needed to use the bathroom when I was a kid, you had to go out the back door and maybe walk 50 metres past the old shed and into the outhouse where this was located. The outhouse was basically a small fibro box around a toilet that was quite tall. The cream paint was peeling off the side of it and the corrugated roof was rusty and stained. It had this old green door and pretty much stood alone in the yard. Just outside the back door was this old tin shed. It was made from solid timber and old brown painted corrugated iron that was nailed to the outside of it. It was also had this large timber door like the outhouse with this massive gap at the bottom that as a kid I could fit under. My father forbid us. We weren't even allowed to go near it. This could have been due to the human shackles that we found in the shed later on that was tied to the workbenches. There were 2 or 3 and they were set up for hands and ankles. At the time I never thought anything of it, but found out later that it was worn out, like the ground was worn out, like someone had been there, sitting there for days or maybe months. Under the house where we lived, wasn't much better, and for years we found bones everywhere. The house stood maybe 4 foot off the ground, enough just so you could move freely under it, hunched over or crawl around. There was deep trenches dug everywhere under that house, with one channel in particular that ended at the dead end. It had this massive steel plate that just sat there. It was really weird and we didn't know what it was all about. One day we got under there and found this 13mm chain that was welded to the door of it. My father, just like the shed, forbid us to go there. We'll later on find out all the horrors that sat underneath it. But that's probably for another video, I'd say. And as for the shed, that was forbidden too, I guess, just like that other part. Around the side of the house wasn't much better. It was haunted with this pet cemetery with maybe 200 odd animals. My father would not only bury our pets there, but he'd also bury random animals that he found around the yard and out on the streets. At night, my parents' room, which was backed onto this pet cemetery area, could always hear the sound of animals scratching at the windows. It was freaky. There was all this scratching and barking and knocks and all this sort of stuff at night. If you were game enough to look outside the window, which when we had friends and cousins over we did, you would go outside but there'd be nothing there. We even did this one time with someone still in the room and they swore that they could still hear the scratching and the noises, but we were outside and there wasn't a sound. The backyard of the house was no safer than the inside or the grounds around it. See, the long backyard backed onto this haunted, spooky bushland area. Now, this was probably for my sister one of the most spooky things about the house. And on our childhood adventures through this bushland, we'd discover ropes and nooses hanging from the trees, barbed wire and rabbit traps everywhere. I even remember this one time my sister's friend was coming with us, and she fell down this makeshift grave with these spikes coming up, just missing her eye. It was crazy. At night, and on the odd occasion, we'd see some random people just walk through our backyard and into the bushland. The crazy thing about this is it didn't go anywhere. Like, we'd see all these people going in, but no one ever came out. I mean, there was no other entries or exits, as this was just this massive void bushland between all the houses. So we always wondered where these people came from and where they were going and what they did. But for me, the most scary, along with the place we avoided the most, was the house next door. Now, as you can imagine, our house was pretty haunted, but nowhere near as bad as this one. The house next door was messed up. I mean, seriously messed up. You could just see it through the blackberry bush that grew right up and down the fence. It was all the way from our fence line, from the road all the way up to the bushland at the back of the property. Its yard was as big as ours, but I guess it was always overgrown. We'd always get brown snakes coming and blue-tongued lizards under the blackberry bush. The house was old, broken down, and same as ours, fibro cement sheeting, but the biggest difference with it was it had this flat roof and ours had this big pitch roof. The house also didn't sit on stumps, it just sat on the ground. Ours was 4 feet off the ground, but this one sat on a concrete slab. For years, the only man that lived there, and we never saw him, well, very rarely, but he had his car parked out on the lawn. And sometimes you'd see the lights on in the house. The people in our neighbourhood, they always said that the man lived there was a doctor. And from what we experienced, he wasn't a doctor that you wanted to go visit at all. He'd boarded up most of the windows from the inside, except for this one window that it had an old red blanket covered on the window. When my sister and I would play in the backyard, we could sometimes see the doctor through the blackberry bush in this broken down old house. What was creepy is we'd always just see him peeking back at us, like peering at us. His eyes were yellowed and beady, and although we could only usually see his eyes, we could always tell he was smiling or smirking at us. And we called him Dr. Dastardly. Now, there wasn't much more to the house than just these things. I mean, it was pretty much riddled with this sort of stuff. And one of the most haunting things we ever encountered was in the ceiling, because this was all over the place. My grandfather and one of his mates had built the house that we lived in by hand back in the 1970s. But when they built it, they used hand tools and no power tools at all, which was pretty impressive. The house, although small, for the most part, was built like you'd expect. It was built to endure some of the toughest times. Like most houses, it had these creepy noises and creaks and groans at night. But there was this one noise that the house had that everyone could tell. It would always start softly and get louder. The noise sounded like an old suspension of a car or something. But this old suspension noise came from inside the house, like up in the roof. Whenever we heard the noise, it usually came after someone was yelling or fighting. Almost like fighting was the trigger that caused this thing to get even louder. Lights would start flickering and, things would start moving around the house. I mean, the lights would actually flicker on and off, like you were trying to turn it on and off yourself. It was freaky. And the sound was crazy too. My parents couldn't afford to move out, so we just became accustomed to this. It was only when friends or family stayed over that we were reminded how haunted and messed up our family home really was. But it wasn't until years later that we were up in the crawl space of the house when my dad was doing some repairs, and it all made sense to us. We'd crawled up to do some repairs, and as we moved around, the old chimney that went through the roof was there. We saw it. It was like strung up with some rope, and the bottom of it was resting on the rafters. It was this olden day pram. Not like a pram that it was like this massive, weird looking pram. It was huge, like it was made for an adult. It was oversized with these big metal wheels and thin rubber and rims. The suspension was made from leather straps to take the weight, and it had this big long drawbar on it at the front. The canopy was also large and helped block out, I guess, to help block out the sun, and it had this lamb's wool sheepskin in it to make it a bit more comfy. I remember absolutely being terrified when I was looking at it and just sitting there thinking, like, what the fuck is that? At the time, I remember having two major questions that I actually mumbled to myself. One was, why in the world was this old pram up in the crawl space of my family home? And how in the hell did it get there? Like, it was too big to fit through the manhole, so none of it made sense. The thing was massive and totally out of place in the roof space. After my initial shock and seeing this creepy pram, I remember looking over at my dad, who had exactly the same look on his face. After we climbed down into the house, we looked at each other without saying a word. Breaking the silence, my dad simply said, we really need to look into this and figure out some questions about how this happened and how it got there. It wouldn't take long before my sister and I could hear Mum and Dad starting to raise their voices in a conversation about it, and the mystery pram in the crawl space became the argument for most of their fights from there on in. Their voices got louder, and you guessed it, the creaks of the old leather straps started to rock and things started to turn on and off. The lights were flickering, and suddenly my parents just stopped talking. They were freaked out about what was happening, just literally above them. That's where it sat, above their bedroom. And they started going to talk to some family members about it. What they actually found out is that my granddad's best mate, who helped build the house, had a disabled daughter. She was about 16 years old, and while they were building the house, she was there. She couldn't really talk too much, and her legs and arms were thin and frail from not being used. She mostly just laid down, I think, in this pram and couldn't really do much else. Due to her disability, they made her pretty comfortable, and they made this big custom pram for her to get her around. But while my granddad and his mate were building the house, she'd be there every day, and she'd be laying in her custom-made 70s pram. Her name was Dahlia. Anyway, halfway through the build of the house, Dahlia had died from a seizure that she'd had laying in the pram while they were up on the roof. The building stopped for a bit, and while they arranged the funeral and bits and pieces, but we're left with this big metal custom pram, as you can imagine. And no one wanted the pram because they all thought it was cursed, because they thought Dahlia was evil. You see, every time someone raised their voice around Dahlia while she was alive, she'd have a fit and start thrashing and banging around in her pram. It was said that someone would, hold on to her and try to settle her down, and she'd rip and claw at their face. My granddad actually told me this story about one of our neighbours who had an argument, and Dahlia was there. She started screaming like she was being murdered. The neighbour ran over to her in fear that she was hurt, but when he got there within reach, she grabbed him and crawled and gouged and bit his face. My granddad remembers the neighbour trying to run away, but when he did, he pulled Dahlia right out of the pram with him because she was hooked onto him, and she just kept scratching and biting at him. He ran with her holding onto him and eventually collapsed. They obviously reported it to police and called them, and they attended, but by the time the police actually arrived, he'd actually died from that much blood loss, and she'd taken chunks of his skin and face, neck, nose, and parts of him all over because no one wanted to go near her. The poor guy had to have a closed coffin, apparently, because half of his face was missing. He didn't have any cheeks, and they couldn't recover any of it because while Dahlia was actually attacking him, she chewed and swallowed parts of him that she'd bitten off. So anyway, as you can imagine, no one wanted the pram because they were scared of Dahlia. And after she died while they were building the house, they felt that because of the evil and the curses that they may get from it, they thought it was a good idea to put it there. So no one was game enough to throw it out, and in their wisdom, they put the pram up in the roof while they were building it. Now, the only way to get the pram up there would be to put it up there before you were building it. And once we learnt this, before you finished the roof, to explain the hauntings we experienced throughout the house, it would be from that moment on, we were warned and cautioned each other, guests, arguing and fighting within the walls of the house, as we knew that what Dahlia was capable of. I could go on for hours telling you stories about my family and my house and the experiences that we had, and I promise I will. But for now, I'll let you enjoy my stories and some of the other ones that I post up, as I want you to hear more about under the house and the bush and the doctor next door and all the things about it. But please subscribe to my channel, turn on the notifications, and get ready for the stories to be released for your entertainment and enjoyment. And remember, if you can't trust the doctor, who can you trust?